It's a privilege to be here this afternoon. So let's just jump right into it. I've got a couple of central themes to share with you this afternoon. The first is that the landscape of clinical research activity and funding in renal disease is not pretty. In fact, I'd characterize it as downright ugly. That said, there are some very interesting, and we just heard some very interesting and some very compelling studies that are out there today. The second is that research is offered as a standard in other disease areas, in oncology in particular. And I'll spend some time comparing and contrasting the research that goes on in oncology with nephrology. The third is that we do have patients that are interested in research when they become aware that those opportunities exist. And finally, we should take advantage of those opportunities, those studies that are out there today, and begin to change the landscape of clinical research in kidney disease and begin to kind of change the narrative. And I think there's some ways that we can do that I'll get to. So let's talk about how ugly the research landscape is. This is a chart. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but this is the number of randomized clinical trials since the beginning of time. The beginning of time, at least for modern day clinical research. The two red circles identify the number of randomized clinical trials in kidney disease, and you can see that that has trailed every other major disease area since 1945. So you might look at that and say, well, you might look at it with a critical eye like I do sometimes and say, well, maybe it's not the number of randomized controlled trials, but it's the number of people who have participated. Maybe we have a small number of trials, but they've been very large, and I can tell you that that's not the case. You might look at that and say, well, maybe that's a little bit misleading because it's not the number of trials or the number of people that have participated in those trials, but it's the success rate of those trials that have gone on, and I can tell you that's also not the case. Interestingly enough, the two lines at the top are infectious disease and oncology. So again, you might look at this and say, well, it ends in 2015. Has anything changed since 2015? And I can tell you no. Nothing's changed really in the last couple of years. This is data from a group called Kaiser Associates. They put out this thing they call the Hot 100 indications every year. And by hot, they mean attractive in a couple of different ways. It's a weighted algorithm that they use. They look at the number of companies that have active programs in a particular indication. They look at the number of programs that are in that indication. They look at academic focus, so the number of papers that were published in that indication. They look at the number of citations to those papers year over year. And not surprisingly, they look at funding, the amount of funding in those particular indications. And for 2018, the only hot nephrology indication among the Hot 100 is kidney transplant, which may not be such a bad thing because I think transplant's an important thing. But it's the only one in 2018 in nephrology that made the top 100. But you see in oncology, year over year, oncology dominates 20 to 30% of the top 100. That also speaks to I think the extent of precision medicine that goes on in oncology as opposed to nephrology. So as I think about these things, I ask a bunch of questions, right? We've seen that kidney disease research has lagged every other major disease areas for the last 70 years or so. Oncology has been at the top along with infectious disease. Just going to point to oncology for today. And the fact is that deaths by cancer have fallen for the last 25 years. So between 1991 and 2016, death by cancer has fallen 27%. So cancer's decreasing. At the same time, this just hit my desk the other day, Kidney News, ASN, headline at the bottom there, national burden of chronic kidney disease is high and rising, and the trends are moving in the wrong direction. And in fact, deaths from chronic kidney disease are on the increase. So between 2002 and 2016, death by chronic kidney disease has risen 58%. So oncology, cancer, chronic kidney disease in the other direction. So I ask, because I have a bit of a marketing background, I suppose, what can we do? How do we change these things? And so I got curious not long ago, and I started to look at funding in these two areas, in oncology and in nephrology. And I looked at the NIH. So for 2019, the NIH has a funding of $39 billion. $39 billion. $6 billion of that, or about 16%, goes to the National Cancer Institute. NIDDK, $2 billion. So that's 5% of the total. So I think that's kind of interesting. But I also remind you that NIDDK has two Ds before you get to the K. So that $2 billion is not all directed at kidney disease, right? I come back to this on page 5. There's a quote in there by a guy named David White, who's with the ASN advocacy side of that world. And he says, and I haven't seen the data that supports this, but his quote, you can take a look on page 5, is that funding for kidney research is less per patient than every other major disease area, including oncology, cardiovascular, diabetes, and so forth. So, just to build a little more comparison here, the cancer moonshot, that's been funded at $1.8 billion over a few years. Kidney X, I point to Kidney X here because it's been characterized in the nephrology community press as nephrology's answer to the moonshot. And I'm a fan of Kidney X, so I'm not being critical here, but Kidney X is funded at $2.6 million. That is 1/700th of the cancer moonshot. You could fit 700 Kidney X's into one cancer moonshot. So come back to me having a bit of a background in marketing and all, and I point to these images here. The pink ribbon. I guarantee you that everyone in the room today and probably watching is aware of what that pink ribbon stands for. I've got a couple of hundred friends on Facebook, and I realize that Facebook is for old people now, according to my kids. But I asked a couple of hundred of my friends on Facebook if they could identify correctly the pink ribbon. Not all of them replied, but I had several dozen responses. Every single person identified that as breast cancer awareness. I held that up next to a green ribbon, which ASN tells me is the color and symbol for kidney disease awareness, and not a single one identified the green ribbon with kidney disease. They identified it with Lyme disease, mental health awareness, I think, and a handful of other things, but not a single one identified it with kidney disease, which I thought was kind of interesting. So one other point on this. If you're a fan of football, American football, go Patriots, by the way. Fan of American football, on one weekend a year, you'll notice that the NFL players on the field are covered in pink. Pink cleats, pink socks, pink jerseys, pink gloves, pink helmets, everything is pink. And here we see the White House bathed in a pink glow. So is this it's changing the landscape a matter of marketing, better marketing, better branding? I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer to that. Is it maybe that we change the narrative in kidney disease? If you look at oncology, it's a war. It's a war on cancer. He's battling cancer, right? She's battling cancer. So maybe we need to change the narrative. I don't know. This is just me kind of talking out loud here a little bit. But I do know this, that we can't change the landscape overnight, right? I don't think any of us in the room, if you can do this, I want to be friends with you, but I don't think any of us in the room or online has the wherewithal to write a $4 billion check and hand it over to NIDDK to get their funding up to where NCI's is, right? But I do think that we can begin to change the landscape. And I think we can do that because it's the right thing to do. It's what our patients are telling us to do. And I think what we really need to do is listen to our patients a little bit more and begin to change that landscape. And I'll come to that in a second. So there's this publication, a survey that came out in December, just last year, by an organization I'm familiar with. It's a survey of patient perspectives on clinical trials. They surveyed 4,000 patients and caregivers in the US. Of that 4,000, 400 identified as having kidney disease. And of that 400, about half identified as being end-stage renal disease. And this study is unique, or this survey is unique, because you can look at the responses by disease area, right? So we can tease out what those 400 kidney disease patients said. And one thing I'll highlight here is, and I don't have it in the slide, but the 400 kidney disease patients that responded here said that they were, 90% of them said that they were either likely or very likely to participate in a clinical trial, depending on the nature of the study. But it wasn't less than 75%. Those are some pretty compelling numbers. We have a patient population that, if they are aware of clinical research, is likely to very likely participate. So let's spend a few minutes looking at some of the data from this survey. The question was, what is the major reason for participating in a clinical trial? And among kidney disease patients, the top reason was altruistic. They wanted to help future patients who come after them, 44%. But if you contrast that with oncology, and I'll point to the bottom row specifically, which asked the option was because I was following my doctor's recommendation. Only 11% of the kidney disease patients identified that as the major reason. Over in oncology, it's 2 or 3 times that, so it's a third. And so, again, being a bit curious, I might ask, well, why is that? Is it because, well, maybe the conversation never happened? Maybe there just wasn't a conversation between the doctor and the patient about a study, and the patient just decided on his or her own, or maybe the patient didn't value the doctor's opinion. We know, though, that that's not the case looking at this data. So the question is around whether or not the patient support influenced the decision to participate in the study or not. And 89% of the kidney disease patients said that the patient's support was important to very important. So we know that the nephrologist's opinion, the nephrologist's attitude towards clinical research is very important in whether or not a potential patient in a study might participate. And I point out as well, and kind of towards the bottom half of this slide, that the support of friends and family are also very important. Roughly half of those respondents said that it was essential to matter quite a bit. And I bring that up because as we think about clinical research and the bottlenecks in clinical research, one of the largest bottlenecks is really finding patients to participate. Enrollment accounts for 30 to 50% of an entire trial. Many studies never end. Many more still are delayed because we can't find enough patients to get into these studies. And so as you think about patient recruitment strategies, I think it's important to identify the friends and family as another party to recruit. But nevertheless, the strength of the physician's influence here, I think, is undeniable. So where do patients with kidney disease want to hear about clinical trials? The number one answer across all disease areas, at least in this survey, is from their physician, right? They want to hear from the physician about clinical studies. They don't want to hear from, I don't know, their hairstylist. They want to hear from their physician, right? And this is consistent with other surveys that I've seen. And I think this speaks a lot to an issue of trust, right? I think that patients trust their physicians. And in fact, I asked the patient one day whether or not, or did the trust that he had in his care team influence his decision to participate in a clinical study. And without hesitation, he said, yes, absolutely. It was probably 95% of what got him to participate. The other interesting thing here is in the bottom row, a source being other clinical trial participants. We see that, interestingly enough, in kidney disease and in the 2 oncology indications over on the left. And again, I come back to, well, maybe we could leverage that as part of our recruitment strategy and identify research patient advocates and get patients speaking to other patients about their experiences in clinical studies. And in fact, I asked a patient, the very same patient, if he would find it helpful to have heard from other patients who are participating in clinical research in his decision-making, and he said, yes, absolutely. Not surprisingly. In fact, his words were, I guarantee you that would be the case. But this is where things, for me, I think, maybe come off the rails. The question here is, has your doctor ever shared information with you about a clinical trial? And it looks like the reality in kidney disease, at least, is maybe not so much, right? 22% said that yes, their physician had shared information with them about a clinical trial. Contrast that with oncology, where the numbers are much greater, 2 or 3 times greater, and you begin to ask some questions about this. I will tell you that I believe 22% is inflated. And I think it's inflated because the 400 patients that were recruited for this survey came from the efforts of the American Kidney Fund. So I think those patients came with a little bias. My own experience would suggest that that 22% is inflated. If I look at the number of patients that we have recruited into our ESRD trials over the last few years and apply some sensible screen fail rate and some other math, and I come up with a number that's a fraction of 22%. Nevertheless, 22% doesn't compare to, half over in oncology. So I think the lesson or the idea here is what I started off saying before. Research today is not offered routinely to our patient population. And that gets me to my call to action today. I think that we can begin to transform the landscape in some very simple ways. And I think that starts with simply, if you're not already aware of clinical research and what that's all about, I think it's a simple thing to go educate yourself and become aware of that. Become aware of the studies that are out there, that are active today, and then begin to have a conversation with our patients, to begin to ingrain into the dialogue research as a standard. And if we were to do that, you might ask, well, what would that world look like? And I've seen data from other disease areas, cardiovascular disease in particular, that demonstrate that patients who participate in clinical trials are more engaged in their care and have better outcomes. Now, we can't demonstrate the same, or we haven't been able to demonstrate the same in kidney disease yet, but I'm hopeful that we will, and I'm confident that we will find in kidney disease the same that I've seen in cardiovascular disease. And we do know, of course, that there are some potential obvious and maybe not so obvious economic and clinical benefits to participating in clinical research, and I'll spend a minute on those. So on the left, we have some of the economic benefits. The 2 obvious ones are investigator grants, right? So the physician gets a grant to participate in the study. The patient gets a small stipend for his or her time and travels and all getting to patient study visits. But the less obvious on the economic side may well be the more compelling may be these cost avoidances, right? So in a traditional industry-sponsored study, investigational product, the experimental drug, in a lot of cases, well, in all cases, is provided free. And we've done some math in our own business to look at this, and those numbers are not insignificant. They can easily get up into 7 figures or so. Then on the clinical side, this idea of an increased intensity of care is kind of interesting, I think. And I actually had a patient characterize this once as what he called double coverage, right? Because you've got the regular clinical team, and then you've got the research team as well, paying attention to you, asking you questions. He called it double coverage. He said he felt like he was getting greater care. I'm using his words. He felt special. And interestingly enough, he said he had a greater sense of security, for what that's worth. I think that's kind of interesting stuff there. One other item I'll point out here is kind of towards the bottom of the consultation on adherence issues. So I asked that same patient he's in an active study right now. I said, being in a study, do you feel that that makes you a better dialysis patient? And he